And I spoke briefly at that time about how appropriate it was that the lectionary lesson for the Sunday after Willard's death should be this passage from Amos, because Willard was one who always wanted to see the absolute plumb line of truth and righteousness and justice. He and I would discuss the headlines in the New York Times or the LA Times, and he would be appalled at the things that were done that were not in line with God's will and God's justice. His very last message, which was printed in the Courier, was, President Obama, forgive Osama bin Laden for his terrible act at the destruction in New York City. And Schwarzenegger raised the taxes of Californians so that they pay for what they get. They want all these wonderful things, schools and roads and police and firemen, and yet they don't want to pay for it. He said things that were not popular, and yet they were exactly in the plumb line of what he saw in the New Testament. When I was in seminary, my professor of Old Testament was James Milenberg, and how he did love the prophets. He took us through Amos and Jeremiah and Isaiah and all of the prophets, and he would stride up and down the aisle declaiming the word, sometimes in Hebrew and sometimes in English. And he would say to us, go out and be prophets. Tell the truth to power at all costs. Don't ever evade or look the other way. Of course, that was not easy to do. And a lot of us who tried it found that it was very, very costly. When I was in seminary, 6 of my best friends were seized and taken away to detention camp purely because they were Japanese Americans. And I was outraged, and I had a little country church 100 miles north of San Francisco. And after this happened, I preached a sermon about how wicked it was to judge people purely by the color of their skin, because these young people that were seized and sent to camp were Christian, preparing for the ministry. They were born in America, American citizens, they went to American schools, they played sports on our teams, they worked for the government, and now all of a sudden, for no other reason than the color of their skin, they were seized and sent to concentration camp. Well, that was an extremely unpopular word to say at that time. It was so shortly after Pearl Harbor. The hatred against the Japanese was colossal. And so the board of my church called me into session and said, don't ever mention the Japanese again in this church. And that faced me with a hard decision. Should I leave, or should I stay and speak the truth? And so for an hour or so that night, I argued with them. I said, I am not talking about the people who attacked Pearl Harbor. I'm talking about Americans, Christians, and personal friends. And I have to speak out for them. So anyway, we declared a truce, and they agreed that I would have the freedom of conscience as long as I stayed at that church. Well, there were other crises through the years, the civil rights movement, which many of you remember, and that was not very popular in the church I had at that time. And then came the farm workers who wanted a union. And when I said I would march with Cesar Chavez to get a union for the farm workers, people called me in and said, we loan money from our banks, we loan money to farmers, we sell chemicals that are sprayed in the fields, and we can't afford to have a minister who is a friend of labor. And again, a long argument ensued because they considered it my fault that I considered the ministry an opportunity for prophecy, an opportunity to defend the defenseless and to help the helpless. So, as it suggests in this very brief passage from Amos, that as soon as he gave his message, Amaziah, who was the right hand of the king, said, get out of this country. We don't want to hear anything like this. We don't want to hear that we are unrighteous, that we are due to have judgment. Go and live in another country and preach your message, but don't preach the message to us. And these words from Amos have re-echoed down through the centuries. Jesus was in the tradition of the prophets. He overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. He said to the scribes and Pharisees, you tithe all these little things, but you neglect justice and righteousness. And of course, for that, he was very, very unpopular. Amos is relevant, and like Willard Hunter, we should all be looking for that plumb line of absolute truth and justice and righteousness that falls down from above into the midst of our society and tells us certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Thank God for people like T. Willard Hunter. Thank God for the message that we are reminded by the lectionary every year, every month, and every Sunday. Something in the lectionary reminds us of our duty to God. Amen.